What would you do if you were told that your country had no natural resources, no farmland, no oil, no water supply of its own, no meaningful military, and no economic safety net, and that it now had to compete in a hostile world on its own terms? This was the position Singapore found itself in 1965, and this was the problem that confronted Lee Kuan Yew. Act 1. Collapse. You see, when Singapore became independent in 1965, it was not the result of a triumphant liberation movement or a negotiated political victory. It was the result of expulsion. Singapore had been part of Malaysia for less than 2 years, when political tensions and ethnic divisions made the union unsustainable. Malaysia decided that Singapore should leave, and the separation happened abruptly. Lee Kuan Yew addressed the nation on television and visibly struggled to hold back emotion as he announced that Singapore would now be on its own. His reaction was not theatrical. It was deeply practical. He understood what independence actually meant for Singapore. The island had no natural resources of any significance. There was no oil, no minerals, no agricultural base, and not even enough fresh water. The economy was small and fragile, dependent largely on trade and on a British military base that was scheduled to close. When that base left, tens of thousands of jobs would disappear almost overnight. The physical conditions of the city were difficult. Much of the population lived in overcrowded housing or informal settlements. Sanitation was inconsistent. Fires were common. Disease spread easily. Ethnic tensions between Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities were real and had already resulted in riots in the previous decade. Unemployment was high, productivity was low, and capital was scarce. Investors saw Singapore as unstable and risky. The regional environment was also uncertain, with Cold War tensions, communist insurgencies, and political volatility across Southeast Asia. Singapore had no army to speak of, no strategic depth, and no allies that could be relied on in a crisis. It was a city-state with the vulnerabilities of a small island and none of the protective advantages of scale. Many observers at the time believed Singapore would fail. Some predicted it would become a poor trading outpost. Others thought it would fall into political chaos. Few saw a path toward prosperity. Lee Kuan Yew did not romanticize this moment. He did not describe it as a heroic struggle or a noble sacrifice. He described it as a survival problem. Singapore's independence was not a victory to be celebrated. It was a reality to be managed. That mindset shaped everything that followed. Act 2. The plan. Lee Kuan Yew approached nation-building as a design problem. His goal was not to create a morally perfect society or an ideologically pure one. His goal was to create a society that worked. He asked what kind of institutions, incentives, and systems would allow a small, exposed, resource-poor country to survive and eventually thrive. He identified 4 strategic priorities that would have to be built together: a clean and trustworthy government, a highly skilled population, an open and globally integrated economy, and a physically functional city. Everything else was secondary. The first priority was corruption. Lee believed corruption was not merely unethical, but destructive. In a small country, corruption spreads quickly and undermines every institution it touches. It weakens trust, discourages investment, distorts incentives, and turns public service into private extraction. Lee strengthened the anti-corruption agency and made it independent from political interference. It was given the authority to investigate anyone, including senior ministers. Prosecutions were public, and the consequences were severe. At the same time, civil servants were paid high, competitive salaries, so that honest work was rewarded, and corruption became an irrational choice. Public office was redefined. It was no longer seen as a privilege or a status symbol. It was a responsibility with heavy scrutiny and real risk. This created a bureaucracy that functioned with a level of competence and integrity that was unusual in the developing world at the time. This clean institutional foundation became one of Singapore's most important assets. It made policy credible, enforcement reliable, and long-term planning possible. The second priority was education. Lee understood that Singapore's only real resource was its people. Without land or commodities, the country's value had to come from human capability. Education was therefore treated not as a social program, but as economic infrastructure. The system was designed to produce the skills the economy needed. English became the main language of instruction so that Singaporeans could operate globally in business, science, and technology. At the same time, students were required to learn their mother tongue to preserve cultural identity and social cohesion. Technical education was emphasized. Polytechnics and technical institutes trained engineers, technicians, and specialists. Universities were expanded and pushed to meet international standards. The curriculum was constantly adjusted to match economic priorities, whether that meant manufacturing, electronics, finance, or biotechnology. Education became a tool of national strategy rather than personal enrichment. It was aligned with development, not detached from it. The third priority was economic openness. Instead of protecting local industries behind tariffs and subsidies, Lee opened Singapore to global capital. He created free trade zones, offered tax incentives, built industrial parks, and actively courted multinational companies. Singapore was positioned as a stable, efficient, corruption-free platform for doing business in Asia. In a region characterized by political uncertainty, Singapore offered predictability, legal reliability, and administrative competence. That predictability became a competitive advantage. Foreign companies brought capital, technology, managerial expertise, and access to global markets. They created jobs, trained local workers, and embedded Singapore into international supply chains. The economy became outward-looking by design. The fourth priority was the physical city itself. Lee understood that economic policy could not succeed if the city was chaotic, unhealthy, or inefficient. Large-scale public housing programs cleared slums and replaced them with planned communities. Home ownership was encouraged as a way of creating social stability and personal investment in the nation's future. Urban planning was centralized and long-term. Land use was optimized, transport systems were coordinated, and infrastructure was built ahead of demand rather than in response to crisis. The city was designed to be livable, efficient, and adaptable. These four pillars reinforced each other. Clean government attracted investment. Investment created jobs. Jobs justified education. Education increased productivity. Productivity raised incomes. Rising incomes stabilized society. Stability made long-term planning possible. This feedback loop was not accidental. It was constructed deliberately. Act 3. The miracle. Over the next 3 decades, the transformation was dramatic. Unemployment fell sharply, real incomes rose, life expectancy increased, education outcomes improved, public safety increased, infrastructure expanded. Singapore moved from a low-income trading post to a high-income global hub. By the 1990s, Singapore had become one of the world's major financial centers, a key node in global manufacturing, and one of the busiest ports and airports in the world. Its public housing system had one of the highest home ownership rates globally. Its schools and universities ranked among the best internationally. Its streets were safe, clean, and efficient. This transformation was not driven by nationalism or charisma. It was driven by institutional consistency. Policies were implemented, evaluated, adjusted, and reinforced. Mistakes were corrected rather than defended. Ideology was subordinated to results. Lee Kuan Yew governed less like a politician responding to short-term pressure and more like an engineer maintaining a complex system. He thought in decades, not election cycles. He focused on structure rather than spectacle. This approach produced what many observers came to call the Singapore miracle, although Lee himself disliked that term. He insisted there was nothing miraculous about it. It was simply the outcome of rational policy applied consistently over time. Act 4. The cost. The success of Singapore came with real and serious trade-offs. Lee did not govern as a liberal Democrat in the Western sense. Political opposition was constrained, the press was regulated, public dissent was limited, laws governing speech and assembly were strict. The political environment prioritized stability over contestation. Lee believed that political conflict, if left unmanaged, would fracture a fragile society and destroy the conditions necessary for development. He believed order had to come before freedom, and prosperity had to come before pluralism. Supporters argue that this discipline was necessary to prevent chaos and enable growth. Critics argue that it suppressed legitimate dissent and concentrated power too heavily in the state. Both are true. Singapore gained stability, safety, and prosperity, but it accepted limits on political competition and public confrontation. This trade-off remains controversial, and it is one of the most important parts of the story. Lee himself did not deny this. He argued that rights without capacity are fragile, and that economic security creates the conditions for meaningful freedom. His critics argue that freedom is not something that should be postponed. This tension between order and liberty remains unresolved, not only in Singapore, but in political theory more broadly. Ending. Could this be repeated today? Now, could this transformation be repeated today? In principle, yes. The underlying mechanisms still apply. Clean institutions still matter. Education still compounds. Openness still attracts capital. Planning still outperforms chaos. In practice, it is far more difficult. The global environment is more competitive. Capital is more mobile. Technology evolves faster. Political polarization is deeper. Public tolerance for centralized authority is lower. Lee Kuan Yew operated in a specific historical context, a post-colonial moment, a Cold War world, a society willing to accept discipline in exchange for stability, and a political system that allowed long-term planning without constant disruption. Modern leaders rarely operate under those conditions. The lesson of Singapore is not that every country should copy its model. It is that development is not a mystery. It is not luck. It is not destiny. It is structure. It is incentives. It is institutions. It is patience. Prosperity is built long before it is visible, in classrooms, in courts, in planning offices, and in what a society chooses to reward. Singapore did not become powerful when the skyline rose. It became powerful when the rules were set. The real question is not whether a country can become Singapore. The real question is whether a country is willing to do the unglamorous work of building the systems that make long-term success possible. History suggests that nations do not rise by accident. They rise by design.